about Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. So, Alice in Wonderland, the story as we know it, was actually created by Lewis Carroll and told on a very hot summer's day, July 4th, 1862. He was on a rowboat expedition with the three little girls who were Dean's daughters. This was at Oxford University. The little girls, as you can see right here, Edith, Alice, and Lorena Little. And this was a story that came about because of Carroll's incredible talent for being able to tell stories right on the spot, his creative brilliance, and the fact that these girls were desperate to hear a story this particular day. However, to understand why this story is so important to us today and why it remains as one of the most beloved children's stories, we have to understand Carroll and the biography of the little girls a little bit better. Carroll was born January 27, 1832 in Cheshire, England. He was the eldest son of 11 children, and from an extremely early age, he already showed an incredible knack at storytelling. He would put on different plays for his family. He would create magazines and scrapbooks for his brothers and sisters. He was this incredibly brilliant child from such a young age. However, as he grew up, when he was 20 years old, he moved to Oxford, and there he became a mathematician teacher, a librarian, and as well as a reverend. And he was known to be dry, logical, introverted, very orderly and neat. In fact, Alice herself, one of the most important of the Dean's daughters, Alice said he was so stiff he appeared to have a poker up him. And and Lewis Carroll, he was born Charles Lubridge Dodson. Carroll was clearly a pseudonym that he used when he created the Alice stories. And one of the biggest, he was an extremely insecure person. And one of his largest insecurities had to do because he had a stammer. And it was such a very obvious stammer, and that's actually one of the reasons why he didn't convert completely into priesthood, because he knew he would have to do sermons and things like that, and he was petrified of speaking in front of large audiences or such. And you see over there, that's a picture that he drew of himself in a letter that he wrote to a friend. That's how he feels. And in fact, the dodo bird in Alice in Wonderland, that is supposed to be a representation of him. He would, sometimes when he would introduce himself, he would say, "My name is Charles Dodgson, therefore Dodo Dodgson." Yeah, and he was a notoriously private person. Although he had a very beautiful hobby of photography, although he never liked being photographed himself. And the reason why he created the pseudonym actually was because every time he got fan letters, he didn't want them to come directly to his door, and if they did, if people found out who this man really was, he would send them immediately back to the post office. The little girls, little as in their last name Little, Edith, Lorena the eldest, Alice the middle daughter, and Edith is the youngest daughter. These were the three daughters of the Dean of Christ Church, which is the college that he taught in Oxford. And these girls came from an extremely glamorous family. I'll refer to him as Carroll from now on. Carroll's first exposure to these girls were actually when they were playing in this beautiful garden that was right outside of his window, and he saw them. And he was immediately inspired and captured by they had this vivacious, charismatic nature about them. They were all photogenic and beautiful. So a lot of the beginning of the relationship was really him. He just received his first camera. And the beginning of the relationship had to do with him trying to get these beautiful girls to sit still so that he could photograph them. They reminded him of some beautiful pixies, really, some like little angels. And actually, this garden, where he saw them for the first time, this is now referred to in Oxford as Alice's Garden. So we can see right here, all throughout, you will see references, geographical references from Oxford that Carroll was able to put into the Alice books. So they're almost like in-jokes. Everybody who lived there or who knew Carroll very well, they understood these references. The story itself, as I showed on the first slide, that was on the river Thames when it was that hot summer day, and Alice, who was the pushiest, although she was the middle child, she was definitely the most extroverted, the pushiest, kind of the most vivacious out of the little bunch. And that particular day, it was so dreadfully hot, however, she pleaded for him to tell them a story. Pleaded, and he said, "No, not this time. eventually she got it out of him. So we see here the importance that Alice in Wonderland began as a story that was completely thought of as he was rowing. As he was rowing this boat, this is exactly what was coming out of his mouth, this gorgeous story with the most enigmatic fairy tale characters that we can think of today. Alice not only was very firm in him telling that story that day, she pleaded for him to write it down for her. And it took about a year. However, on Christmas of 1863, Carroll presented Alice, the middle child, with this gorgeous, it's almost like an illuminated manuscript version of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which he hand wrote and hand illustrated himself. And it is the most flawless manuscript you can ever imagine. It is absolutely breathtaking. It has no mistakes whatsoever, and he spent months and months and months making sure that the layout is perfect so that when he makes his final manuscript as this present for her, it will be absolutely immaculate. And afterwards, the book actually was published in 1865, and this is incredibly important because this was a time when Victorian literature has finally found the child. That was the same year that Great Expectations and The Water Babies came out, as well as David Copperfield. Those were all published in the same year. And what made Carroll's masterpiece so much different than all of these other books was that he was so much involved with the creation of the story when it would go out for the mass public, when it was published. He made sure that this book had a red cover. He knew that's what would attract children. Whereas the Great Expectations, David Copperfield, and The Water Babies, all of their original bindings, you could see they either had blue or green covers. And he knew that red would attract the child. Today, he stands as the most quoted author after Shakespeare and the Bible. And the original publication, it's been translated into 174 languages, all major ones, many minor ones, some extinct languages, and a made-up one, which is pretty creative considering the story's content itself. So, as I was saying, the references and the different Easter eggs of Oxford that are found throughout the story, one of the most notable is during the very famous Tea Party scene with the Mad Hatter, where the Dormouse begins singing his little chant to Alice, and he talks about the treacle well. Over here, that was a spot where Carroll would take the little girls often for picnics. And over here, once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters, and their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of the well, the treacle well, that is. And you can see here, all 3 girls made it into the Alice story. You see, Elsie, Lorena, Charlotte, those were, so if you say it verbally, L-C, that's for her name. Lacey is just a mix-up of the letters of Alice, and Tilly was the family pet name for Edith. And it's important to note that during many of these excursions that he would take these little girls out all around Oxford, he was often accompanied by one of his colleagues, Robinson Duckworth. And so not only were these 3 little girls whose ages ranged from 12 to 3 years old, not only were they listening to these fantastical stories, but it was also an academic. So you have to understand that these jokes that he made within this story, all of these characters, they all had references that could be academically and intellectually understood. So they could be understood, they were all mathematically perfect, so therefore Duckworth wasn't bored, and definitely the girls weren't bored. Alice's Adventures herself, so clearly the story is called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and like I said before, Alice, though she was the middle child, she was certainly the most important to Carroll in relationship-wise, and she was most inspirational towards him. And so here we see his original drawings that could be found in that original manuscript. These are all hand-drawn by him. And we see the details, how meticulous this man was, how expertly detailed he was. He took a real-life rabbit, actually, and he put it on his desk, and he kept redrawing it, and that developed into the fairy tale rabbit we know as the White Rabbit, who really looks like a suitor to Alice over there, as you can see. And one of the most historians on Carroll, they like to debate on this a lot. He has a lot of controversies surrounding him. However, this is one of the most, I think, interesting parts, was that you see the way he drew Alice, the style that he draws her, and she's very wistful, kind of dreamy looking, and all of the characters, all the animal characters particularly, they have these hunched over backs, and they have kind of these startled eyes, they're always following her. And I think it's extremely important to note that these characters, we only meet them when Alice meets them. These really are Alice's adventures in Wonderland. They're really there just as extras. Therefore, to Alice, this is a new magical world. However, for these characters, this really can be some sort of open prison that they reside in, and they're just trapped within. They cannot escape. So, and that leads to the nightmarish quality of this world. Wonderland is an incredible place when you read it and when you hear about it. However, it does have very horrific things that happen. I mean, Alice gets shrunk and stretched and everything like that. And for children to read this book, or to be read this book, I think that image of falling down a rabbit hole and not knowing where the end is, as Alice does in the very beginning of the story, that sticks with you. That's something that is almost horrific. You know, there's no end in sight or anything. And all the rules in Wonderland are broken. And this is extremely important considering this was a man. This world was created by a man who loved rules. He was a logical person. He didn't show his creativity outside, especially not by the way he dressed or the way he spoke or anything. However, clearly, although he loved order and rules, he liked breaking them more so than and Wonderland was that escape, that was that route that he was allowed to break those rules. However, the logic remains in the story. Over here, I put one of the most famous quotes, and I think one of the most logical. But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, but you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad. And she asked, how do you know I'm mad? And he said, you must be, or else you wouldn't have come here. And one of the most important things, I think, is that when children read this, all of these weird characters, they're all representations of how children see adults. The Red Queen, the Mad Hatter, all of these strange animal characters, they really are representations exactly of how children hear adults and see adults. They shout strange orders, they give nonsensical advice and things such as the Red Queen, you know. When we read the book, off with her head, that the Red Queen demands, the child reads it and says, oh, go to your bed. That's something that my mother says. Go to your bed, off with your head. It relates. The child understands it better than we understand it now. So, and Alice herself, one of the most incredible characters, one of the most complex characters, probably the first young female heroine in Victorian literature, age 8. And she is the voice of common sense in a very nonsensical world. And I think that, I'm certain that it's hard for us to remember now, but when we were her age, when we were children, we viewed the adult world the exact same way as Alice views Wonderland. Very absurd, nonsensical, who wants to grow up? Nobody makes sense around here. And so Alice really is, we go through the world through her eyes, and all of that absurdity that we see in Wonderland, those are memories that we have now suppressed or repressed or we don't have anymore simply because we have grown up. And although she challenges everything that she's expected to obey, even in the real world when she's reading with her sister, she doesn't want to read these stories, you know, she doesn't want to learn her lessons, you know. However, as directionless and purposeless as she is in Wonderland, we still end up getting somewhere. I think one of the most important things that you have to know about Carroll is this relationship that he had with children, because that is where a lot of his scandal comes from. Unfortunately, there is no complete evidence for this. However, pedophilia does surround his name. It is something that is highly debated on amongst all ends of historians who study him. However, he was not like other adults. He declared that children were 3/4 of his life, and I think because he was such a creative person, because he was so talented in storytelling, and he had these fairy visions within him, he was able, children followed him wherever he went. You know, on train stations he would be making little magic tricks or puppet shows or something, and children were inspired by this, you know. So he had tons of children friends, and he wrote them letters, as you can see here. He would replace many of the words with actual pictures, which is pretty creative and very cool, I think, to be receiving that as a child back then. And over here you see his photography that he took. That over there on the very far my right, you can see Alice, that is the little girl, and over there are the 3 sisters. And here are just different examples of this fairy tale mind that he had within him that he could not find anywhere else in the world, therefore he had to create it over and over and over again, through photography or through stories. And I don't think I have time to really talk about the lovers tokens, but this Wonderland, his photography, all of those, his relationships with children, friendships with children, those were all really a refuge against the adult world. The Lost Diary pages. So as I mentioned, he kept this relationship with the dean's daughters, the three girls. However, a year after he presented Alice with that beautiful manuscript, something happened and he was exiled from Christchurch for 6 months. He was invited back in December. But nobody knows what happens because there were 14 diaries and we only have 9 today. So there's 5 of them that are missing, and there's plenty of pages that were ripped out by his nieces who inherited his belongings after he had died. So nobody knows what had happened, what caused the split, and why he was exiled away and forbidden to ever contact the little girls again. One of the most promising theories is that it had to do something with the mother's influence, that she was very disappointed in Carroll, and maybe she saw something such as a kiss or something inappropriate, and that caused her to be extremely, well, as a mother, she was known to be a pretty snobby woman. However, she wanted dukes and earls and princes to be courting her daughters, and Carroll wasn't any of that. Therefore, she wanted to separate them. So it could have been the mother that split them. She actually took all of those beautiful letters that Carroll sent to the girls over the years, and she burnt them in front of the girls' eyes in the wastebasket. That was pretty horrific. However, over here we see a letter that was written from Lorena, who was the eldest daughter, to Alice in the 1920s when a biographer was interviewing them for the first biography on Lewis Carroll. And here she says, in regards to why he was exiled, she explained to the biographer, she said, "I said his manner grew too affectionate to you as you grew older, and that mother spoke to him about it, and that offended him. And so he ceased coming again, as one had to give some reason for all intercourse ceasing." And it's perfect explanation, it's still extremely vague, and the worst part is that we don't know which word to stress. Do we stress he grew too affectionate, meaning he did something inappropriate, he kissed her in a wrong manner or something like that, and showing too much affection that was by age very inappropriate? Or do we stress the word to you? Because there's other theories that Carroll was actually supposed to be courting Lorena, who was the eldest. She was 13 at the time, and that is the age of when you could get married in that time, and he clearly saw more interest in Alice than he did with Lorena. So those are all possibilities, they're all out there, and over here we have the last picture that Carroll took of Alice, actually, when she was much older, you see. She was about 18 years old, and this is actually right after the youngest daughter, Edith, had died, her youngest sister, who was a beloved sister to her. So you can see how very sad and very almost like a ghost she looks in this. And one of the most important, or one of kind of a fun fact, is that when Alice grew up, she named one of her sons Carroll. And she always denied that it had no connection with Lewis Carroll, but what a name, and that seems very, yeah, and on the same path, Carroll later years, he denied that Alice was ever inspired by a real girl, however. So we have two people desperately in denial. And over here, I want to show you, I want to read to you a quick excerpt of one of Virginia Woolf's essays on Lewis Carroll, which I think it's what we have forgotten and why we can't relate to the story as well when we were children. She says, "Mr. Dodgson at once denies the shadow. My life," he says, "is free from all trial and trouble, but this untied jelly contained within it a perfectly hard crystal. It contained childhood. And this is very strange, for childhood normally fades out. Wisps of childhood persist when the boy or girl is a grown man or woman. Childhood returns, sometimes by day, more often by night, but it was not so with Lewis Carroll. For some reason, we know not what, his childhood was sharply severed. It lodged in him whole, and